In the spring of 1847, a census taker in Oglethorpe County, Georgia, recorded an anomaly that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 17 children under the age of 5 at Whitmore Hall Plantation shared identical facial features and a distinctive birthmark. When he inquired about paternity, the plantation mistress Evelyn Whitmore showed him breeding records more detailed than any livestock registry. Then she revealed a locked wing where her 3 adult sons lived in isolation, instruments in her most depraved experiment. What the county never recorded was how Evelyn had turned her own sons into overseers of a breeding program that defied every moral boundary. The truth remained buried until 1993, when documents revealed how far one widow would go to maintain absolute control. Before we continue with the story of Whitmore Hall, hit that subscribe button. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your state or city in the comments below. The widow's inheritance. When control became obsession. Evelyn Whitmore became a widow at 38 years old on a December morning in 1839 when her husband Marcus collapsed in the cotton fields he had walked every day for 20 years. The doctor called it apoplexy, a sudden failure of the heart that left no time for goodbyes or final instructions. The funeral was held 3 days later under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the uncertainty now hanging over Whitmore Hall. 200 guests attended, filling the parlor with whispered condolences and barely concealed speculation about what would become of the plantation, the enslaved people, and the widow herself. What Marcus left behind was more complicated than grief. He left Evelyn with a 2,000-acre plantation, 67 enslaved people, 3 sons aged 19, 17, and 15, and a debt structure that would consume the property within 2 years if yields did not increase dramatically. The numbers were documented in ledgers that Evelyn spent her first week of widowhood studying with an intensity that made the household servants nervous. She took meals at Marcus's desk, surrounded by account books and correspondence with cotton factors in Savannah, teaching herself the mathematics of survival in a world that did not expect women to understand such things. Most widows in Oglethorpe County would have remarried quickly, transferring the burden of management to a new husband who understood cotton, markets, and the brutal economics of plantation life. The social pressure was immediate and relentless. Within a month, 3 separate men had approached Evelyn with offers that were framed as assistance but functioned as proposals. Each one promised to relieve her of responsibilities too complex for feminine sensibilities, to guide her sons toward proper manhood, to restore order to a household that surely could not function under maternal authority alone. Evelyn Whitmore was not most widows. She declined each offer with a politeness that barely concealed her contempt, and she began making decisions that signaled her intention to maintain control regardless of social expectations. She promoted her most experienced overseer, dismissed the one who questioned her authority, and restructured the plantation's operations according to calculations she had made after weeks of studying Marcus's records and identifying inefficiencies he had tolerated out of sentiment or tradition. But it was in the privacy of her study, in the late hours when the household slept, that Evelyn began contemplating possibilities that went beyond mere agricultural improvements. She had inherited not just land and debt, but human beings whose bodies, labor, and reproductive capacity represented assets that Marcus had never fully exploited. He had allowed families to form naturally, had permitted marriages between enslaved people, had even shown reluctance to separate mothers from children when financial pressures suggested such sales would be profitable. Evelyn saw these allowances as weaknesses, emotional indulgences that had cost the plantation thousands in lost efficiency. If she was going to save Whitmore Hall, if she was going to prove that a woman could manage an estate as effectively as any man, she would need to approach every resource with cold rationality, including the resource that walked on 2 legs and called itself human. The 3 sons, shaping instruments of her design. Benjamin, Marcus Jr., and William Whitmore had been raised as Southern gentlemen, educated in the classical style with tutors who taught them Latin, literature, and the proper deportment expected of plantation heirs. Their father had envisioned futures for them that extended beyond cotton and land management. Benjamin, the eldest, had talked of studying law in Charleston. Marcus Jr. had shown interest in medicine. Even William, at 15, had demonstrated a talent for sketching and painting that suggested artistic inclinations his father had gently encouraged. All of those futures died with Marcus Whitmore in December 1839. Within a week of the funeral, Evelyn summoned her sons to the study and explained the financial reality they now faced. The plantation was drowning in debt, she told them, her voice carrying none of the grief they expected, but instead a clarity that felt almost surgical. Their father had been a good man, but a careless manager, too concerned with the comfort of his workers and not concerned enough with the survival of his family. If they wanted to keep Whitmore Hall, if they wanted to maintain their position in Oglethorpe County society, they would need to abandon childish dreams and commit themselves entirely to the plantation's success. In the months following their father's death, Evelyn began a different kind of education for her sons. She started with small responsibilities that seemed reasonable, even necessary. Benjamin was assigned to oversee field rotations, learning to calculate optimal planting patterns and soil recovery schedules. Marcus Jr. took charge of supply inventories, documenting every tool, every pound of seed, every yard of cloth distributed to the quarters. William, despite his youth, was given authority over discipline, recording infractions and administering punishments, according to a scale Evelyn had devised that assigned specific consequences to specific violations. Then the responsibilities grew darker, more specific, more deliberately designed to erode the boundaries between family duty and moral transgression. Evelyn began bringing her sons into conversations about the enslaved population that treated human beings as livestock requiring management. She showed them how to evaluate physical characteristics, how to identify strong breeding potential, how to calculate the future value of children not yet born. She spoke in clinical language that drained the humanity from every transaction, referring to enslaved people by their economic function rather than their names, describing reproductive capacity the way one might discuss the yield potential of a cotton field. By the spring of 1840, the three young men had become extensions of their mother's will, performing tasks their father would never have countenanced. They sat beside Evelyn during Sunday reviews where she assessed the enslaved population, noting which women were pregnant, which children showed promise for future labor, which men possessed physical traits worth preserving through controlled reproduction. They listened as she explained her theories about inheritance, about how strength, temperament, and intelligence could be bred into enslaved populations the same way farmers bred better livestock. Benjamin, at 19, tried once to object, suggesting that perhaps they should focus on improving cotton yields through agricultural methods rather than human manipulation. Evelyn's response was swift and devastating. She pulled out the debt ledgers and showed him exactly how close they were to losing everything, then asked him which he valued more, his squeamishness or his inheritance. Benjamin never objected again, learning instead to compartmentalize, to perform his duties while constructing mental walls between his actions and his conscience. The ledger of lineage. When people became data. In Marcus Whitmore's study, Evelyn found her husband's plantation records, standard documentation of purchases, sales, births, and deaths among the enslaved population. The entries were simple, almost apologetic in their brevity. Names, ages, occasionally a note about a particular skill or a family relationship that Marcus had wanted to preserve. The ledgers showed a man who had tried, however inadequately, to see the people he owned as something more than property, who had recorded their humanity even while participating in the system that denied it. Evelyn began keeping her own ledger in January 1840, but her entries followed a different pattern entirely. She purchased a large leather-bound book with blank pages, and on the first page she wrote a title in her precise script, Whitmore Hall Genetic Improvement Project commenced January 15, 1840. What followed was documentation that transformed human beings into data points in an experiment that existed only in Evelyn's increasingly detached mind. She recorded not just names and ages, but detailed physical characteristics measured with the thoroughness of a naturalist cataloging specimens. Height, weight, skin tone described in gradations she had devised, hair texture, bone structure, muscle development, dental condition, and any distinguishing marks or features. Next to each entry, she added temperament assessments based on months of observation: compliant, resistant, intelligent, dull, strong-willed, broken, cooperative, defiant. The words reduced complex human personalities to simple categories that served her purposes. But the ledger went further still. Evelyn traced family histories spanning 3 generations when such information was available, creating genealogical trees that mapped relationships across decades. She was looking for patterns, trying to identify which characteristics appeared reliably in offspring, which traits seemed to breed true, and which varied unpredictably. She noted which families produced children who survived infancy at higher rates, which mothers had easy births, which fathers had produced multiple healthy offspring with different partners. Most disturbingly, she began writing what she called compatibility ratings, codes that appeared next to certain names and indicated her calculations about which pairings would produce optimal results. She used a system of letters and numbers that only she understood, marking some individuals with notations like A7, suitable for strength enhancement, or B4, intelligence potential, monitor offspring. Next to the names of certain women, she wrote projected dates for breeding assignments, calculated based on their monthly cycles, their age, their recovery time from previous births. The ledger was not mere record-keeping. It was a blueprint for engineering human beings according to specifications that existed only in Evelyn's mind. Specifications that valued physical strength, docility, and reproductive capacity, while showing no concern for the emotional bonds, the family relationships, the simple human desire to choose one's own partner and raise one's own children in something resembling peace. By the end of 1840, Evelyn's ledger contained detailed entries for all 67 enslaved people on Whitmore Hall, with 23 of them marked for inclusion in what she had begun calling her advancement program, though advancement toward what remained deliberately vague. She kept the ledger locked in her desk, allowing no one to examine it, not even her sons, though they would soon enough learn its contents through the roles she assigned them in bringing her documented plans to reality. The reward system. Pleasure as currency of control. Evelyn understood that absolute control required more than fear and punishment. Fear kept people compliant, but it also bred resentment, resistance, the kind of slow sabotage that could undermine a plantation's efficiency in ways difficult to trace or prove. What Evelyn needed was a system that made the enslaved population complicit in their own exploitation, that offered enough hope and reward to prevent rebellion while maintaining her complete authority over every aspect of their lives. In the spring of 1841, she implemented what she called the advancement program, announcing it to the enslaved population during a Sunday assembly, that she had her sons organize in the yard between the main house and the quarters. She stood on the porch, elevated above the gathering, and explained in terms carefully chosen to sound generous rather than coercive. Hard work would be recognized, she told them. Loyalty would be rewarded. Those who demonstrated exceptional dedication to Whitmore Hall's success would receive privileges that others could not access. The privileges, she described, sounded substantial to people who had been given nothing their entire lives. Better food, actual meat and vegetables, rather than just cornmeal and salt pork. Reduced work hours on Sundays, improved quarters, cabins with real floors and weatherproof roofs. Small amounts of money they could use to purchase items from traveling merchants. The promise dangled before them like water before people dying of thirst. and Evelyn watched their faces carefully, noting who showed interest, who remained skeptical, who seemed to calculate whether the reward was worth whatever price she had not yet specified. But there was one privilege she did not mention publicly, one that she revealed only to the men she had selected based on her ledger's calculations. In private conversations held in her study, she told them about additional rewards available to those who proved most valuable. Access to women, she said, using language that made it sound like an opportunity rather than an assignment. The chance to form connections, to experience companionship, benefits typically denied to people in their position. What she did not explain, what the selected men would only gradually understand, was that these encounters were not spontaneous or private. They were orchestrated, documented, and designed to produce children whose parentage Evelyn could trace with certainty. The women were chosen based on characteristics Evelyn wanted to preserve or combine. The timing was calculated according to fertility cycles she had been tracking for months. The location was controlled, taking place in the overseer's cottage that Evelyn had prepared specifically for these sessions, isolated enough for discretion, but close enough for her supervision. The men involved believed they were earning favor, gaining access to something precious in a world that gave them nothing. They did not yet understand they were participating in a breeding program where their own biology had become another resource to be extracted and controlled, where the pleasure offered as reward was simultaneously a tool of Evelyn's genetic experiment. Some of them felt genuine affection for the women they encountered. Others simply appreciated any moment of human connection in lives otherwise defined by brutal labor and constant surveillance. Evelyn documented every session in her ledger, noting dates, participants, and 9 months later, outcomes. When children were born from these arranged encounters, she recorded their characteristics with the same clinical precision she had used for their parents, already calculating their future value, already planning the next generation of pairings that would further refine the population according to her design. The selection process. Choosing mothers for an experiment. Not every enslaved woman on Whitmore Hall was included in Evelyn's program. The selection criteria were exacting and revealed the depths of her calculated approach to human engineering. She spent months observing, documenting, and evaluating before making her choices, treating the process with the seriousness of a scientist selecting specimens for a critical experiment. The women had no say in whether they would be chosen, but Evelyn's selection process determined which of them would face the particular horror of her breeding program and which would be spared, at least for the moment. Age was the first criterion. Evelyn chose women between 16 and 28, young enough to have many potential childbearing years ahead, but old enough to have demonstrated their fertility. She excluded women under 16, not from any sense of morality but from practical calculation. Younger girls' bodies were less predictable, more likely to face complications in pregnancy and childbirth that could result in lost investment. Women over 28 were considered less valuable, their remaining fertile years too few to justify inclusion in a program designed to produce multiple children per participant. Fertility was the second criterion, but Evelyn looked for specific evidence beyond simple age. She prioritized women who had already borne children, whose bodies had proven capable of successful pregnancy and delivery. She reviewed birth records going back 5 years, noting which women had given birth to healthy infants, which had experienced stillbirths or children who died in infancy, which had struggled with difficult labors that left them weakened or injured. She wanted women whose fertility was not just theoretical, but demonstrated, whose bodies were reliable producers of living children. The survival rate of previous children was equally important. Evelyn was not interested in women who could become pregnant if their children consistently died before reaching working age. She examined records of infant and child mortality, identifying women whose children had survived past age 5, suggesting not just successful pregnancies but strong constitutions passed from mother to child. These were the women whose genetic contributions Evelyn wanted to preserve and propagate throughout her enslaved population. Temperament was the fourth criterion, more subjective but no less important in Evelyn's assessment. She observed how women responded to orders, how they interacted with overseers, how they behaved during the brief moments of leisure allowed on Sunday afternoons. She was looking for what she called appropriate deference, women who complied with instructions without requiring constant supervision or threats. But she did not want women who were completely broken, whose spirits had been so thoroughly crushed that they moved through life like automatons. Broken women, in Evelyn's calculation, produced broken children, and she wanted offspring who would be productive workers, not hollow shells requiring excessive management. Most critically, Evelyn chose women who had no living male partners on the plantation, or whose partners she had deliberately sold away in the months leading up to her program's implementation. This eliminated the complication of existing family bonds that might interfere with her controlled breeding assignments. A woman with an established partner might resist being assigned to another man, might grieve openly enough to draw sympathy from others, might produce children while still emotionally attached to someone outside Evelyn's plan. Women without partners were isolated, vulnerable, more likely to accept whatever opportunity was offered, because they had nothing else, no one else, no competing loyalty that might complicate their participation. By the summer of 1841, Evelyn had selected 12 women who met all her criteria. Their names appeared in her ledger marked with special notations indicating their inclusion in the advancement program. The women themselves were informed individually, called to the main house where Evelyn explained in terms designed to sound like opportunity rather than coercion, that they had been chosen for special consideration, that their cooperation would bring rewards, that their futures and their children's futures would be better than those who remained in the regular work rotations. Some of the women felt relief, hoping this might mean easier lives. Others felt dread they could not name, sensing that whatever Evelyn was offering came with a price that had not yet been fully revealed. Benjamin's initiation, the eldest son's first assignment. Benjamin Whitmore was 21 years old in the summer of 1841 when his mother summoned him to her study and explained his new role with the clinical detachment of a plantation owner discussing crop rotation. The afternoon heat made the room oppressive, and Benjamin stood by the window hoping for a breeze that never came while his mother sat at her desk. The infamous ledger opened before her, speaking in that measured tone she had adopted since his father's death, a voice drained of warmth and filled instead with cold calculation. She needed him to personally oversee certain breeding assignments, she explained, to ensure the genetic combinations she had calculated would produce optimal offspring. The women she had selected required partners of specific physical and temperamental characteristics, and the enslaved men she had chosen for the program needed supervision to ensure compliance and proper documentation. But there was another component, she continued, her eyes never leaving his face. Some of the most valuable genetic combinations required qualities that the current male population did not possess in sufficient measure. For these assignments, she would need Benjamin himself to participate directly. Benjamin's initial horror, carefully documented in letters he would later try to destroy, surged through him with physical force. He felt his stomach contract, his hands begin to shake, and he gripped the windowsill to steady himself. This was not plantation management, he wanted to say. This was not what gentlemen did, not what sons did, not what any moral person could possibly justify regardless of economic necessity. But his mother continued speaking before he could form the objection into words, her voice cutting through his revulsion with the relentless logic she had perfected over months of planning. This was not exploitation, she insisted. This was scientific management of resources, no different from breeding horses for speed or cultivating hybrid cotton strains for higher yields. The enslaved population represented genetic potential that had been wasted under his father's sentimental management. Marcus had allowed random pairings, had permitted bonds based on affection rather than utility, had essentially squandered the plantation's most valuable renewable resource through careless administration. Evelyn was simply correcting those inefficiencies, applying rational principles to a process that had been left to chance for too long. If Benjamin refused, she continued, he was abandoning his family duty, allowing the plantation to fail, sentencing everyone, including the enslaved population, to the brutal uncertainties of bankruptcy and forced sale. Did he want his younger brothers thrown into the world without inheritance? Did he want the enslaved people sold to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where they would face conditions that made Whitmore Hall seem merciful by comparison? Did he want to lose everything his father had built because he lacked the fortitude to make difficult decisions? The argument was carefully constructed, appealing to duty, family loyalty, and even a twisted form of compassion that suggested refusal would cause more harm than participation. Benjamin found himself unable to counter her logic, not because it was sound, but because she had trapped him in a framework where every objection seemed like weakness, every moral concern like childish sentiment that reality could not afford. He agreed that evening, though the word caught in his throat like broken glass. His mother showed no triumph, only satisfaction, as if she had expected nothing less. She explained the protocols with bureaucratic precision. He would be informed when his participation was required. The sessions would take place in the prepared cottage. The women involved had been selected for their physical and temperamental suitability. He was expected to approach the task with the same professionalism he would bring to any other plantation duty, documenting outcomes and reporting any complications. Benjamin left the study and walked to the furthest edge of the property, where the cotton fields gave way to pine forest. He stood there until darkness fell, trying to reconcile the person he had believed himself to be with the person he had just agreed to become, trying to find some internal narrative that would allow him to proceed without destroying himself entirely. The cottage, where boundaries dissolved. At the eastern edge of Whitmore Hall's property stood an overseer's cottage that had been vacant since Marcus's death. The previous overseer had lived there with his family until an accident with a plow horse had killed him in the spring of 1839, and Marcus had never hired a replacement, preferring to manage the plantation with the assistance of trusted enslaved workers who knew the land better than any outsider could. The cottage had sat empty for 2 years, slowly accumulating dust and the particular sadness that attaches itself to abandoned places. In the fall of 1841, Evelyn had it cleaned with a thoroughness that made the household servants exchange nervous glances. She ordered the floors scrubbed, the windows washed until they gleamed, the cobwebs swept from every corner. She had furniture brought from storage in the main house, items too fine for an overseer's cottage but selected with deliberate care. A proper bed with a real mattress, not the rope and straw pallets used in the quarters. Curtains for the windows, plain but substantial, blocking the interior from outside view. A small stove, a wash basin with clean water replenished daily, even a mirror on the wall. Luxuries that created a space neither quite slave quarters nor quite part of the main house. She designated it for what she termed genetic optimization sessions, the clinical language disguising the reality of what would occur within those walls. This was where the selected pairings would take place, removed from the quarters where other enslaved people lived, isolated enough to maintain discretion, but close enough for Evelyn's supervision. She could walk to the cottage in less than 5 minutes, could observe from a distance without being obvious, could maintain control while creating the illusion of privacy. The cottage became a liminal space where the plantation's normal hierarchies twisted into something more psychologically complex. In the fields and quarters, the lines were clear and brutal. White owners commanded, enslaved people obeyed, and violence enforced any transgression of that order. But in the cottage, those boundaries blurred in ways that made everyone involved uncomfortable for different reasons. Here, enslaved women were brought to encounter not anonymous overseers or visiting strangers, but the plantation owners' own sons. Young men they had watched grow up from children, whose scraped knees they had witnessed, whose temper tantrums they had heard through the walls of the main house, whose family meals they had served year after year. The women understood something the Whitmore sons were still learning: that power did not disappear simply because it operated in a space designed to look almost domestic. The bed, the curtains, the relative comfort changed nothing about the fundamental coercion underlying every encounter. They had not chosen to be there. They could not refuse without consequences. The apparent civility of the setting made the experience more disturbing rather than less, because it forced them to perform something resembling consent, while everyone involved knew the truth. For the Whitmore sons, the cottage represented a different kind of horror. Here they could not maintain the psychological distance that made plantation management bearable. They could not think of the women as abstract units of labor or genetic potential. They had to face them as individuals in an intimate setting that mimicked courtship or marriage while being neither. They had to perform duties their mother had assigned while pretending, even to themselves, that this was somehow acceptable, somehow justifiable, somehow different from the crimes they knew it resembled. The cottage accumulated secrets with each session. The enslaved women who were brought there learned to shut down emotionally, to remove themselves psychologically from their own bodies, to comply mechanically while keeping their true selves locked away in interior spaces no owner could reach. The Whitmore sons learned different survival techniques: compartmentalization and rationalization, telling themselves stories about duty and necessity that allowed them to continue without completely breaking under the weight of their own actions. Marcus Jr.'s resistance. The middle son's moral crisis. Unlike Benjamin, who had learned to compartmentalize his role through intellectual detachment and careful emotional distance, Marcus Jr. could not silence his conscience. At 19, he was old enough to understand what his mother was orchestrating, but young enough to still believe that morality mattered, that principles could trump economic necessity, that there were lines a decent person simply did not cross regardless of the consequences. His father's death had devastated him in ways his brothers did not fully comprehend, because Marcus Jr. had been closest to his father, had spent hours with him discussing philosophy and ethics, had absorbed his father's growing discomfort with slavery, even though Marcus Sr. had never found the courage to act on that discomfort. His diary from 1842, discovered in an attic trunk in 1968, reveals a young man torn between filial duty and moral horror, between the economic realities his mother emphasized with relentless precision and the human cost he witnessed in the eyes of women who had no power to refuse his presence. The entries are painful to read, marked by increasing desperation and a growing sense that he was being forced to choose between his soul and his family, between moral integrity and basic survival. April 3, 1842. One entry reads, "Mother insists there is no difference between what we do with human breeding and what any farmer does with livestock. But livestock do not weep silently when they believe no one is watching. Livestock do not look at you with eyes that hold both accusation and resignation. I cannot reconcile what I am being asked to do with anything Father taught me about honor, duty, or basic human decency. Yet when I raise these concerns, Mother produces the ledgers and shows me how close we are to losing everything, and I find myself agreeing to things I know are wrong because I cannot bear the thought of my younger brother losing his inheritance because I lack courage." He tried to confide in the local minister in the summer of 1842, arranging a private meeting after Sunday services and attempting to explain his situation without revealing the full extent of his mother's program. He spoke in hypotheticals and abstractions, asking questions about duty to family versus duty to conscience, about whether economic necessity could ever justify moral compromise, about what a Christian man should do when obedience to earthly authority required disobedience to divine law. The minister, an elderly man who had served Oglethorpe County's plantation families for 3 decades, listened with the patient expression of someone who had heard variations of this conversation many times before. His response was gentle but devastating. He reminded Marcus Jr. that a son's duty was obedience, that God had established hierarchies for good reason, that women of his class, particularly widows managing estates alone, required the support and loyalty of their sons without question or rebellion. He suggested that Marcus Jr.'s doubts were themselves a form of pride, an elevation of personal judgment above proper submission to authority. The conversation ended with advice that crushed the last hope Marcus Jr. had been nursing, that questioning maternal authority was itself a form of dangerous rebellion that could lead to moral chaos if left unchecked. "Trust your mother's wisdom," the minister concluded. "She carries burdens you do not fully understand. Your role is support, not judgment." Marcus Jr. left the church understanding that he would find no ally in religion, no external authority that would validate his moral intuitions against his mother's cold logic. His diary entries after that meeting show a young man slowly breaking under the weight of complicity. He began drinking in private, hiding bottles in his room and consuming enough to numb himself before the sessions his mother assigned him. He developed insomnia, lying awake through the night, replaying conversations and encounters, trying to find some internal narrative that would make his actions bearable. He withdrew from social interactions, refusing invitations to neighboring plantations, avoiding the young women from other families who might have been suitable matches for marriage. The first births. When theory became reality. In the spring of 1842, the first children of Evelyn's program were born, and theory became undeniable reality in ways that forced everyone involved to confront what they had participated in creating. 3 infants arrived within 6 weeks of each other, all healthy, all bearing the distinctive physical markers Evelyn had predicted based on her careful analysis of parental characteristics. The births were attended by the plantation's midwife, an elderly enslaved woman named Ruth, who had delivered babies on Whitmore Hall for 30 years and who performed her duties with professional competence while maintaining a silence that suggested she understood far more than she was willing to speak aloud. Evelyn recorded each birth with scientific precision in her breeding ledger, noting exact dates, times, birth weights estimated rather than measured, but recorded nonetheless, and detailed physical characteristics visible even in newborns. Hair texture, skin tone cataloged according to the classification system she had devised, the shape of facial features, the size and strength of limbs. She examined each infant personally, spending time observing them in ways that made the new mothers deeply uncomfortable, a quality of attention that was both intense and empty, as if she were looking through the baby's present existence to some future utility they would serve. The first child was a boy born to a woman named Hannah, fathered by Benjamin according to the assignments Evelyn had orchestrated 9 months earlier. Evelyn named him Samuel in her ledger, though she allowed Hannah to call him what she wished in the quarters, and she recorded his characteristics with obvious satisfaction. "Strong bone structure," she wrote, "well-proportioned limbs, alert expression suggesting intelligence, minimal distress during delivery, excellent specimen, high future value." The clinical language reduced a human infant to a successful product, validation that her methodology worked. The second child, a girl born to a woman named Catherine, showed characteristics Evelyn had specifically bred for, a combination of her mother's supposed docility and her father's physical strength. Evelyn recorded her with equal satisfaction, already planning which male child from future breeding cycles might be paired with this girl when she reached reproductive age, already calculating genetic combinations 2 decades into the future. The third child, another boy born to a woman named Mary, completed the initial trial of Evelyn's program. 3 healthy infants whose very existence proved that human beings could be bred for specific characteristics just as reliably as livestock. The mothers were allowed to nurse their children, a concession Evelyn made based on practical calculation rather than sentiment. Nursing mothers produced healthier infants with higher survival rates, and Evelyn needed her experimental subjects to survive in order to validate her methods. But the women were quickly returned to modified work assignments, lighter labor than field work, but still productive, still contributing to the plantation's operations. They were given 2 hours morning and evening to nurse, time strictly measured and enforced, and the rest of their days were spent in tasks that kept them visible and controlled. Most significantly, Evelyn established a centralized nursery in a building near the quarters, ostensibly to provide better care for the children, but functionally to maintain her control over every aspect of their development. The infants spent most of their time there, supervised by 2 elderly enslaved women who followed detailed instructions Evelyn had written about feeding schedules, sleep routines, and developmental monitoring. The mothers could visit during nursing times and briefly in the evenings, but the children belonged to the nursery. To Evelyn's system, more than they belonged to the women who had borne them. This separation served multiple purposes in Evelyn's design. It prevented strong maternal bonds that might complicate future breeding assignments. It allowed Evelyn to observe the children's development without interference from maternal instincts that might coddle or protect them from the evaluation she needed to conduct. And it sent a clear message to everyone on the plantation. These children were not family units to be preserved. They were experimental subjects whose futures would be determined entirely by their utility to Evelyn's expanding program. William's compliance. The youngest son's transformation. William Whitmore was only 17 when his mother first explained his role in the breeding program. Young enough that he had not yet fully formed his own moral framework independent of parental authority. Malleable enough that Evelyn's logic could be imprinted before competing philosophies took root in his developing conscience. Unlike his brothers, who had known their father well enough to inherit some of Marcus's more humane instincts and ethical concerns, William's memories of his father were hazier, less emotionally significant, more easily overshadowed by his mother's presence and her relentless certainty about how the world operated. To William, his mother had always been the dominant force in the household, even before his father's death. Marcus Sr. had been kind but distant, often preoccupied with plantation business, more comfortable with his older sons who could discuss literature and philosophy. William had been the baby, the afterthought, the child who spent more time with servants and tutors than with either parent. When his father died, William grieved dutifully but did not feel the profound loss that had devastated Marcus Jr., or even troubled Benjamin. His world had always revolved around his mother's approval, and his father's absence changed the household dynamics less for William than it did for his brothers. When Evelyn began explaining the breeding program to William in the fall of 1842, she did so gradually, carefully, presenting each component as natural and necessary rather than shocking or morally questionable. She started with general principles about plantation management, teaching him to view enslaved people as economic assets requiring careful administration. She showed him breeding records for horses and cattle, explaining how controlled reproduction improved livestock quality over generations. Then she introduced her ledger, presenting it as a simple extension of the same principles applied to the plantation's human property. William showed no initial resistance because he had no framework for resistance. This was simply how things worked in his understanding, how power operated, how families like theirs maintained their position in a world that was already built on the ownership of human beings. If enslaved people were property, and property was managed for maximum utility, then managing their reproduction seemed no different from managing any other aspect of plantation operations. Evelyn's clinical language reinforced this perspective, draining away any emotional content that might have triggered moral doubt. By 1843, William had become his mother's most reliable instrument, performing his assigned duties with mechanical efficiency that suggested either complete moral anesthesia or a capacity for psychological compartmentalization that exceeded even Benjamin's carefully constructed detachment. Where Benjamin drank to numb himself and Marcus Jr. filled diaries with anguished self-examination, William simply complied, showing no apparent internal conflict about his role in the program. He attended the sessions at the cottage with the same demeanor he brought to reviewing crop yields or inspecting equipment. He documented outcomes in the ledger with neat handwriting and thorough attention to detail. He reported complications to his mother without emotional inflection. He had learned to view the enslaved women not as human beings with interior lives and feelings, but as components in a system his mother had designed, as objects that served a function no different from the cotton gins or plows. The household servants noticed something disturbing about William's transformation. The boy who had once shown kindness, who had snuck sweets to the kitchen children, who had cried when his favorite hunting dog died, had become someone else entirely. His face had taken on a flatness of affect that suggested he had successfully killed whatever part of himself had once been capable of empathy or moral imagination. He looked through enslaved people now rather than at them, his eyes focusing on some middle distance, as if the bodies before him were merely obstacles temporarily blocking his view of more important matters. His brothers recognized what had happened to William, even if they could not articulate it clearly. Their mother had gotten to him young enough to shape him completely, to mold his conscience before it could develop resistance to her philosophy. William was not struggling against his role the way Marcus Jr. did, was not building elaborate mental defenses the way Benjamin had learned to do. William had simply accepted, internalized, and become a perfect instrument of their mother's will. Perhaps the most disturbing outcome of Evelyn's program, because it demonstrated how easily human conscience could be prevented from forming if the right pressures were applied early enough and thoroughly enough. The expansion. When one plantation wasn't enough. By the summer of 1843, Evelyn's program had produced 12 children, all healthy, all conforming to her predictions about genetic inheritance. Her ledgers showed increased plantation values, not just from improved cotton yields but from the enslaved population itself, which had grown through carefully controlled reproduction rather than expensive purchases at auction. Other plantation owners began to notice Whitmore Hall's unusual prosperity, and Evelyn, never one to miss an economic opportunity, began offering consultations. She framed it as management advice, scientific approaches to labor optimization, but what she was really selling was her breeding methodology. 3 neighboring plantations adopted modified versions of her program between 1843 and 1845, creating a network of coordinated human engineering across Oglethorpe County that would eventually involve over 200 enslaved people across 4 properties. Evelyn had always believed Whitmore Hall was too small for her ambitions. A single plantation could produce wealth, yes, but an entire system, aligned, predictable, obedient, could create something closer to an empire. She visited neighboring estates not as a guest but as an inspector, walking the fields with a small leather notebook tucked under one arm, jotting observations as if the people around her were livestock in a controlled trial. She spoke in gentle tones, polite enough to pass for Southern hospitality, but every recommendation she made carried the weight of cold arithmetic. Bloodlines, temperaments, muscle density, projected yields. She discussed human beings the way a botanist might discuss seed varieties. The owners listened, some out of greed, others out of fear. They had heard about her son's mysterious injuries, the whispers of impropriety behind closed shutters. But profit has a way of washing away unease. They saw her children, tall, strong, fast, and convinced themselves that Evelyn had tapped into something modern, scientific, inevitable. The country was changing, after all. Railroads, telegraphs, steam engines. Why shouldn't plantation labor change too? Within months, she had installed herself as the unofficial overseer of a 4-property region. Each plantation received a set of written guidelines, breeding schedules, pairing suggestions, nutritional regimens, and, most disturbingly, behavioral conditioning techniques. Evelyn insisted that consistency was the foundation of progress. Deviation, she warned, would corrupt the results. Her influence seeped into everything. The plantations began coordinating harvests, synchronizing work rhythms, even sharing young enslaved women selected for what she called propagation excellence. Families were split, recombined, tracked, and evaluated. Evelyn reviewed monthly reports in candlelit rooms, marking each name with symbols only she understood. Behind her composed facade, there was the unmistakable glimmer of someone who believed she was crafting a legacy far larger than cotton. The enslaved people understood the truth long before the owners did. They could feel Evelyn's reach tightening around them like a noose, silent, methodical, closing with each passing season. Songs changed, prayers grew sharper. Elders warned the young to avoid Evelyn's gaze, for she was not simply a mistress, but something colder, something that looked at them without seeing them. By late 1845, the 4 plantations operated like the limbs of a single organism. Evelyn stood at its center, watching, calculating, expanding. And in Oglethorpe County, the quiet dread that followed her grew with every birth she counted, every ledger she updated, every life she quietly rearranged into her design. The psychological toll, what the sons paid in silence. The Whitmore brothers aged rapidly between 1841 and 1845, not in years but in the quality of their silence, the weight they carried in their expressions, the way they avoided certain conversations and certain rooms. Benjamin developed a drinking habit that he carefully concealed from his mother, but that the household servants noticed and quietly discussed. Marcus Jr.'s diary entries became increasingly fragmented, philosophical meditations on sin and redemption that never quite named what he was seeking redemption for. William, the youngest, showed different symptoms, a flatness of affect that suggested he had successfully killed whatever part of himself had once been capable of empathy. The 3 young men rarely spoke to each other about their shared duties, maintaining a conspiracy of silence that was itself a form of survival, because acknowledging what they were doing would require confronting questions they could not answer. Benjamin, who had once been the most outgoing of the brothers, began spending long hours in the old smokehouse behind the fields, telling others he needed solitude to review Mother's accounts. In truth, he sat on overturned barrels with a bottle tucked beneath his coat, drinking slowly, deliberately, as though he believed the liquor could wash the stench of his memories clean. When he staggered back toward the main house, he forced his face into a practiced neutrality, terrified that Evelyn might smell weakness the way some animals do blood. Marcus Jr., meanwhile, retreated into writing. He filled entire notebooks with rambling passages on fate, divine punishment, and the hollowness of obedience. Some entries were written in a neat, controlled script. Others dissolved into frantic scratches, ink blots spreading like bruises. He asked questions he could not bear to speak aloud. If a sin is commanded, does the sinner still belong to God? If a mother demands the sacrifice, is the son still culpable? Each time he neared a truth he feared, his handwriting collapsed into unreadable lines. William, the youngest, reacted differently. He shut down. Conversations with him became single-syllable exchanges. His eyes no longer betrayed emotion, only a distant calculation, like someone trying to live life 1 inch removed from his own body. Servants whispered that William walked through the halls like a ghost who had not realized he was dead. Evelyn praised him most, mistaking emotional numbness for discipline. At night, the brothers lay awake in separate rooms, listening to the quiet breathing of the house. Sometimes they could hear each other pacing. Sometimes they could hear muffled sobs that none of them ever acknowledged in daylight. Their shared burden created a strange intimacy, but one based on mutual destruction, not closeness. They could not discuss their guilt. They could not share their nightmares. They could not even meet one another's eyes for long without remembering what bound them together. By 1845, the Whitmore brothers were no longer individuals. They were three fractured reflections of the same crime, living proof of a mother's ambition carving out the humanity of her own sons. And beneath their silence was the knowledge that the damage Evelyn demanded from them was not temporary. It was the kind that buried itself deep, surviving long after the fields went quiet and the ledgers closed. Sarah's story. One woman's silent resistance. Among the women selected for Evelyn's program was Sarah, 23 years old, born on the plantation. Her mother and grandmother before her had worked Whitmore soil. Sarah had already borne 2 children by 1842, both fathered by a man Evelyn had sold to a plantation in Alabama, specifically to eliminate his presence from her controlled breeding calculations. When Sarah was assigned to the cottage for her first session with Benjamin Whitmore, she carried with her a small piece of broken mirror she had hidden in her dress, a fragment sharp enough to serve a purpose if she chose to use it. But Sarah's resistance took a different form than violence. She complied with every instruction while maintaining an emotional distance so complete that Benjamin found himself unnerved, performing his duty mechanically while Sarah's eyes looked through him as if he did not exist, as if she had removed herself to some interior space he could not reach or contaminate. Sarah had learned the art of retreat from her grandmother, who had survived the worst years of the Whitmore lineage. As a child, she listened to stories of how her grandmother had kept her spirit alive by folding pieces of herself into hidden corners of her mind, places where no overseer, no master, no cruelty could follow. When Evelyn's program began selecting women, Sarah revived that inheritance. She did not scream. She did not fight. She simply vanished inside herself, leaving behind only the outline of a woman fulfilling commands. Benjamin felt this absence immediately. He expected fear. He expected tears. What he received instead was a flat, unreadable stare that stripped away the illusion of power. She was physically present, but spiritually unreachable. He found himself fumbling, frustrated, shaken by a sense of being judged by someone who had no authority, but whose silence felt heavier than any accusation. Sarah understood the value of that silence. It was her weapon, her shield, her rebellion. Each time she entered the cottage, she left a different version of herself outside the door. The girl who laughed with her friends at dusk, the mother who hummed lullabies, the descendant of women who had endured generations of cruelty. Inside, she became an empty vessel, responding without engaging, enduring without surrendering. Evelyn misread Sarah entirely. She saw the compliance, but not the defiance beneath it. She praised Sarah's stability, calling her one of the program's most reliable subjects. She noted Sarah's temperament in the breeding records, unaware that the very stillness she admired was a mask designed to keep Sarah's real self untouched. The other enslaved women noticed, though. Sarah's quiet strength became a whispered lesson. Resistance did not always need fire or blood. Sometimes it needed only refusal. Refusal to let the oppressor shape one's soul. Some nights, the women gathered beside the quarters and asked Sarah how she kept her mind intact. Sarah never gave answers. She only looked toward the sky, a silent reminder that endurance could be a form of victory. And in a place built to crush spirits, Sarah's unbroken interior world became more dangerous than any weapon she could have carried. The census anomaly. When numbers revealed patterns. The census taker who arrived at Whitmore Hall in the spring of 1847 was a methodical man named Albert Pritchard, trained in Boston, uncomfortable with Georgia's heat, and more uncomfortable with the social structures he was documenting. He approached his work with mathematical precision, noting names, ages, and relationships in columns that should have formed sensible patterns. But at Whitmore Hall, the numbers did not make sense. Too many children under 5. Too few women of childbearing age for that many births. And most disturbingly, physical similarities among children who were supposedly unrelated. Similar enough that Pritchard found himself double-checking his notes, wondering if he had recorded names incorrectly. When he mentioned the anomaly to Evelyn, she invited him to examine her breeding records with a frankness that shocked him more than any attempt at concealment would have. From the moment he stepped onto the property, Pritchard sensed something unusual. The plantation was tidy, efficient, eerily quiet for a place reliant on so much suffering. Children played in the dust yards, but even their laughter seemed muted, as if shaped by invisible rules. Each face reminded him of another, slightly similar bone structure, similar spacing of the eyes, a repetition of features difficult to dismiss as coincidence. He began asking routine questions, parental names, birth months, family groupings. But each answer pushed him further into confusion. Some children had no listed father. Others had mothers whose timelines did not line up with the recorded births. One child, no more than 3, bore such a striking resemblance to one of Evelyn's sons that Pritchard paused mid-sentence, unsure whether to trust his own eyes. When he brought the inconsistencies to Evelyn, expecting defensiveness, she instead offered him sweet tea and an invitation to her study. She opened her ledgers with theatrical calm, pages filled with columns of dates, pairings, outcomes, health notes, and evaluations written in her precise hand. She spoke not like a plantation mistress, but like a scientist, thrilled to have an audience capable of appreciating her work. Pritchard felt the hair on his arms rise. The neat annotations reduced human lives to breeding stock. His training told him to remain impartial, but his conscience recoiled. Evelyn explained her system with chilling clarity, how she selected ideal traits, how she ensured genetic predictability, how she believed she had improved the economic efficiency of the region. He recorded her explanations, though his pen trembled. Each word felt like a betrayal of his own humanity, yet he could not look away. He knew he had stumbled into something far larger than a census irregularity, an engineered system hidden in plain sight. Before leaving, he lingered near the slave quarters. A group of children watched him, their expressions guarded. And in their faces, he saw the truth Evelyn had catalogued but never confessed. A single origin, replicated again and again, masked by lies scribbled into family columns. As Pritchard mounted his horse, he realized the numbers did not merely reveal a pattern. They revealed a design, and a designer who no longer cared who discovered it. The locked wing, where the sons were kept. As the breeding program expanded, Evelyn made a decision that revealed how completely her thinking had detached from conventional maternal feeling. She moved her 3 sons into a separate wing of the mansion, ostensibly to give them privacy and independence as adult men, but functionally to isolate them from normal family life and normal social interactions. They took meals separately, maintained their own schedules, and were discouraged from attending social functions, where they might form attachments to young women from other plantation families. Evelyn told concerned neighbors that her sons were dedicated to the plantation's success, too busy for courtship and marriage. But the truth was more calculated. She could not risk them forming loyalties outside her control, could not allow wives who might question the program or grandchildren whose presence might complicate the genetic lines she was so carefully maintaining. The sons had become tools, and tools did not require social lives. The locked wing quickly took on an atmosphere of quiet decay. What had once been guest rooms and sitting parlors became dim corridors where time moved differently. The brothers' footsteps echoed strangely, as if the house itself had begun to observe them, measuring their movements with the same clinical scrutiny Evelyn applied to everyone else. Meals were left for them on a sideboard near the entrance. Trays of food delivered by servants, instructed not to linger. Even conversations were limited. The door to their wing might as well have been the door to a monastery, closing them off from the world. Benjamin felt the isolation first. He would stand by the windows at dusk, watching lantern lights flicker across the fields, longing for the simple chaos of being among other people. Marcus Jr. retreated deeper into his philosophical notebooks, developing a monastic discipline of silence, broken only by the scratch of his pen. William adapted most easily, drifting through the empty rooms with the numb acceptance of someone who had already resigned himself to being reshaped. Evelyn visited them rarely, never staying long. Her presence transformed the wing into something colder, as though her footsteps carried frost. She entered only to give instructions, to assign tasks, to reinforce the distance she insisted was necessary for clarity of purpose. Her sons tried at first to speak to her, to express their unease, to ask why they were being kept apart from the world. But Evelyn brushed these questions aside with the brisk efficiency of someone rearranging furniture. To justify the arrangement, she told the community that her sons were scholarly, shy, uninterested in frivolous company. She referenced their scientific responsibilities, hinting at work too important to be interrupted by courting or social obligations. Most believed her. A few did not. But Evelyn's reputation for severity discouraged further inquiry. Inside the locked wing, the brothers grew increasingly detached from normal emotions, normal hopes, normal futures. The walls absorbed their frustration, their quiet arguments, their sleepless pacing. They were young men living in rooms designed for confinement, not comfort. Rooms meant to break them gently, almost politely, until they aligned perfectly with their mother's monstrous vision. And without realizing it, each became something Evelyn had always intended. Not sons, but instruments. Not men with destinies, but components of a machine she believed would outlive them all. The breaking point. Marcus Jr.'s attempted escape. In the fall of 1846, Marcus Jr. disappeared for 3 days. The household assumed he had gone to Savannah on business, but when he returned, his clothes were muddy, his hands blistered, and his eyes held a wildness that suggested he had been somewhere far beyond the city's organized streets. He had walked, it would later be revealed, nearly 40 miles toward the Tennessee border, driven by a desperation to escape not just the plantation, but himself, the person he had become under his mother's direction. He was found by slave catchers who assumed he was a runaway and held him until his identity could be confirmed. Evelyn collected him personally, paid the finder's fee without comment, and brought him home. The punishment was not physical, but psychological. She increased his responsibilities in the program, assigned him to more sessions in the cottage, making escape impossible by deepening his complicity until guilt became its own form of imprisonment. Marcus had not planned the escape. It happened late one night after a session in the cottage that left him trembling, staring at his own reflection in a wash basin until he could barely recognize the face looking back. Something inside him snapped, quietly but decisively, and he walked out of the locked wing without grabbing money, food, or even shoes. He slipped through the fields like someone fleeing a burning building, his breath ragged, his limbs burning with panic. He walked until his feet bled, driven by an instinct older than reason, an animal urge to distance himself from the place that had consumed his childhood and poisoned his adulthood. The deeper he moved into the wilderness, the more he felt pieces of himself returning, as though the forest air diluted the poison that had been fed into him for years. But freedom was an illusion that followed him at a short distance. Slave catchers spotted him near a narrow road, confused by his clothing, but confident he was property. Marcus was too exhausted to resist. He offered no argument, no explanation, only collapsed under their shouted orders. They locked him in a small holding shed used for runaways. Marcus spent the night staring at the cracks in the wood, realizing he was trapped in a cycle he could not break. When Evelyn arrived, she thanked the men with chilling composure. She placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder with a gentleness that made his stomach twist. Affection delivered like a command. On the journey home, she spoke softly, telling him he had momentarily forgotten his duties, but would soon regain his sense of purpose. His punishment began the next morning. She doubled his cottage assignments. She assigned him to record the results, making him write in the ledgers that cataloged the human consequences of his actions. Each task forced him deeper into the machinery he had tried to outrun. By winter, Marcus Jr. no longer fantasized about escape. He understood what his mother had engineered, a prison so internal that running would never be enough. The children. Growing up in Evelyn's shadow. By 1847, the oldest children of the breeding program were 5 years old enough to show personalities, preferences, the individual characteristics that mark them as human beings rather than experimental subjects. But Evelyn's interest in them remained clinical. She observed their development with the detachment of a naturalist studying insects, noting which children showed intelligence, which showed physical strength, which displayed temperaments suitable for different types of labor. She had already begun planning their futures, calculating their breeding potential, matching them in her ledgers with combinations that would produce a next generation even more perfectly designed for her purposes. The children sensed something wrong in how the plantation mistress watched them, a quality of attention that was both intense and empty, as if she saw through their present selves to some future utility they would serve. To the children, Evelyn was not a maternal figure. She was a presence, silent, pale, dressed in stiff fabrics that rustled like dry leaves when she approached. She rarely spoke directly to them, preferring instead to watch them from verandas or doorways, recording her observations in small notebooks. The children would pause in their play when they noticed her gaze, though they did not understand why. They only knew instinctively that this woman was not watching them with kindness. Some of the children grew bold, testing boundaries. One girl repeatedly tried to slip away from the supervised play yard, wandering toward the woods. A boy with a quick mind stole pencils from the office and scribbled drawings on the cabin walls, shapes Evelyn interpreted as markers of early spatial reasoning. Another child, unusually strong for his age, dragged a wooden bucket filled with stones across the yard to impress the others. To Evelyn, these were data points, pieces of her ongoing experiment. The enslaved mothers tried to shield their children as best they could. They told stories at night to remind them of identity, of heritage that Evelyn's ledgers could not erase. They whispered warnings, teaching their sons and daughters how to appear compliant while guarding the parts of themselves that Evelyn sought to catalog and claim. The children listened, absorbing the strange duality of their world. Play in the sun, but never forget the shadows watching. Evelyn's ledger entries became increasingly ambitious. She wrote predictions beside each name, projected heights, expected temperaments, future pairings. She imagined a second generation, stronger and more controllable. Each child assigned a purpose before they were even old enough to understand the world they lived in. Sometimes when the children laughed, Evelyn looked displeased, as though joy disrupted the order she intended to impose. She wanted efficiency, not childhood. She wanted predictability, not personality. The more the children became themselves, the more she saw them as problems to be corrected. By the end of 1847, the children had learned a painful truth. At Whitmore Hall, growing up meant being observed, measured, and prepared for futures none of them chose, all under the cold shadow of a woman who believed she could design generations as easily as she pruned her orchards. The investigation. When questions finally came, Albert Pritchard, the census taker who had documented Whitmore Hall's anomalies, could not forget what he had seen. Back in Boston, he mentioned the unusual breeding records to an abolitionist contact who immediately recognized the implications. Letters were written, inquiries were made, and by early 1848, pressure was mounting for an official investigation into practices at several Georgia plantations, with Whitmore Hall at the center of concern. The investigation moved slowly, hindered by local authorities who had no interest in examining practices that were technically legal under Georgia law, even if they violated every standard of human decency. But the pressure continued, amplified by northern newspapers that had begun publishing accounts of systematic breeding programs, genetic experiments conducted on enslaved people, and the role of plantation families, including women and their sons, in orchestrating these operations. What began as whispers among abolitionists soon developed into a broader social scandal. Editors in Boston and Philadelphia printed serialized accounts of Southern human stock farms, describing operations so coldly organized that even those accustomed to hearing about slavery's cruelties found themselves stunned. The Whitmore name appeared often, usually accompanied by phrases like breeding ledgers, controlled reproduction, and maternal orchestration of incestuous lines. The North recoiled. The South bristled. Georgia newspapers denounced the coverage as Yankee exaggerations, branding Pritchard a liar seeking notoriety. Still, the letters continued. Churches petitioned their congregations to demand oversight. Quaker groups held town meetings where Pritchard's testimony was read aloud, transforming a quiet census anomaly into a moral indictment echoing across states. Influential abolitionists quoted his findings in speeches, describing Whitmore Hall as proof that slavery was not only a system of forced labor, but a laboratory of human manipulation. Georgia officials tried to stall. They formed committees that dissolved before meeting. They appointed investigators who disappeared into polite society, returning with vague reports insisting that no actionable wrongdoing had been uncovered. Local sheriffs laughed off the accusations. Judges claimed their hands were tied. After all, breeding enslaved people was considered property management, an uncomfortable practice perhaps, but one deeply woven into the legal fabric of the region. But the North did not relent. Pritchard's original notes were published in a Boston pamphlet titled The Ledger Children, which sold thousands of copies. The pamphlet included sketches of children who resembled one another too closely, excerpts from Evelyn's breeding charts, and accounts of mothers forced into calculated pairings. Ministers read the pamphlet from pulpits, activists carried it into town halls, politicians waved it during heated debates in Massachusetts. By mid-1848, Georgia officials could no longer ignore the mounting suspicion. A small investigative delegation, half-hearted, undermanned, and underfunded, was sent to Oglethorpe County. They interviewed neighbors, examined property records, and questioned overseers who responded with rehearsed answers. Evelyn herself received them with flawless courtesy, providing tea, offering tours, and presenting her ledgers with the poise of someone who believed she would never face consequences. The investigation produced no charges, but it produced something Evelyn feared far more: attention. Attention that spread like fire. Attention that could not be silenced, and attention that would soon tear apart the empire she believed she had built in secret. The collapse. When the system turned on itself. In the spring of 1849, everything Evelyn had built began to unravel. Benjamin, now 29 and showing signs of complete psychological breakdown, confessed the full scope of the program to a visiting minister, who had the courage and connections to make the testimony public. Marcus Jr., released by his brother's confession from the burden of secrecy, provided detailed documentation, including copies of his mother's ledgers and his own agonized diary entries. Even William, the most compliant son, seemed relieved when the truth finally emerged, as if exposure was a form of liberation from a role he had never wanted, but had lacked the strength to refuse. Evelyn faced not criminal charges. Georgia law in 1849 offered no protection for enslaved people from breeding programs, but social exile. Families who had consulted with her disappeared from her social circle. The plantation's financial partners withdrew. Her sons left, scattering to different states, seeking anonymity under different names. Benjamin's confession came during a storm-laden afternoon, when the minister stopped at Whitmore Hall seeking shelter on his way to Athens. He asked routine pastoral questions about the health of the family, questions Benjamin had heard all his life. And for the first time, Benjamin could not answer with the expected politeness. The words spilled out of him in tremors, the pairings, the schedules, the commands, the children who resembled him more than he could bear. He wept. The minister listened in stunned silence. Within days, the confession reached northern reform circles. By the time newspapers printed excerpts, the story had transformed into a national scandal. A southern matriarch orchestrating an incest-based breeding system to expand her enslaved labor force. The shock value alone ensured circulation. Letters poured into Georgia, demanding investigation, even though the legal structure of slavery left no room for prosecution. Marcus Jr.'s contribution was decisive. He delivered copies of Evelyn's ledgers, pages of dates, pairings, measurements, and notations written in her precise handwriting. The diaries he added were even more damning. Long passages about coercion, despair, and the spiritual collapse of a man forced to participate in his mother's ambitions. These documents reached abolitionist societies, then newspapers, then congressional halls. Evelyn's name became synonymous with a particular kind of moral rot. Plantation families who once admired Evelyn now severed ties. They stopped inviting her to gatherings. They denied having sought her advice. Some even hinted that they had always suspected something strange about the Whitmore boys. Financial partners withdrew loans and demanded repayment. Merchants refused credit. Evelyn found herself navigating a world in which she was not legally guilty but socially untouchable. Her sons disappeared quickly. Benjamin left first, boarding a train without telling anyone his destination. Marcus followed weeks later, traveling north with nothing but a suitcase of manuscripts. William vanished into Texas territories, claiming land under a false name. None of them looked back. By winter of 1849, Whitmore Hall still stood, but hollowed, abandoned from within, stripped of the very heirs Evelyn had shaped, and the reputation she once wielded like a weapon. The aftermath. What remains? When truth emerges, Evelyn Whitmore died in 1851, alone in the mansion that had once represented her triumph over widowhood and financial uncertainty. The children of her breeding program, 17 in total, remained enslaved until emancipation in 1865, carrying with them the knowledge of their origins and the psychological scars of having been born, not from love or chance, but from their enslavers' calculated genetic experiments. The Whitmore sons never reconciled with each other or with their past. Benjamin died in California in 1873, Marcus Jr. in Illinois in 1881, and William in Texas in 1889, each having constructed new identities that erased any connection to Georgia and the years they had spent as instruments of their mother's will. The plantation itself was sold and subdivided, the breeding ledgers buried in family archives, until they surfaced nearly a century and a half later, forcing descendants to confront an inheritance more complicated and more horrifying than simple complicity in slavery. It was the revelation that even family love could be weaponized, that maternal authority could become monstrous, and that the greatest horrors are often perpetrated not by strangers, but by those we are taught to trust absolutely. When Evelyn died, no obituary honored her. The local paper printed only a single sentence noting her passing, devoid of praise or condemnation. Her burial was attended by a handful of neighbors who came out of obligation rather than affection. No sun stood at her graveside, no hymns were sung. The wind carried dust across the coffin before the first shovel touched earth. The children she engineered grew into adulthood under the shadow of her decisions. Some worked the fields until freedom. Others were hired out to nearby plantations, their reputations whispered about by overseers who noticed their unusually similar features. A few tried to trace family connections after emancipation, comparing memories and stories in an attempt to reconstruct a lineage deliberately scrambled by Evelyn's ledger. Though they forged new lives, they bore a silent scar. The knowledge that they had been designed, not born, assigned, not welcomed. The Whitmore sons lived as fugitives from memory. Benjamin drank himself into illness, haunted by hallucinations of children calling out to him. Marcus Jr. became a schoolteacher in Illinois, known for his quiet kindness and his refusal to discuss his childhood. William married into a small Texas family and ran a modest cattle farm, telling his children only that his past didn't matter. Yet all three carried the same unspoken truth. They were products of their mother's ambition, participants in her cruelty, and survivors of a world that had twisted their humanities into an instrument. Decades later, when the breeding ledgers resurfaced in the attic of a distant relative, historians were stunned by their detail. The ledgers rewrote local history, revealing a story not simply of slavery, but of calculated biological engineering, carried out under the guise of plantation management. Families descended from the victims found themselves confronting a past that reached into their own bloodlines. And in the end, the story of Whitmore Hall became a reminder that the architecture of cruelty often begins within the walls of a home, that the hands that harm most deeply are sometimes the ones that once held us